Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The leader of the opposition has a long and very clear track record on foreign wars. He's against them. But when a brutal dictator has used chemical weapons on helpless civilians, is reasonable conversation really enough? Jeremy Corbyn is with me. Jeremy Corbyn, you're calling for the debate tomorrow. Theresa May, we know, is going to come to the House of Commons and explain why she did what she did. Would you like to see a proper debate and a vote at the end of that?
Yes, I would, because I think Parliament should have a say in this, and the Prime Minister could quite easily have done that. She took a decision sometime last week that she was going to work with Macron and Trump in order to have an attack on the chemical weapons establishments in Syria. She could have recalled Parliament last week. It's only the Prime Minister that can recall Parliament. Or she could have delayed until tomorrow when Parliament returns itself. There is precedent over previous interventions where Parliament has had a vote. And I think what we need in this country is something more robust, like a War Powers Act, so that governments do get held to account by Parliament for what they do in our name.
And if there is now a parliamentary vote, would you like that to be a vote which would, as it were, tie her hands to stop a repetition of what happened this week happening again?
What I would like is a vote which outlines a process that could now happen. That is, giving the OPCW the chance to go in and fully investigate everything, including the debris from the bombing attack, but also a very strong steer to our government to now go back to the UN and promote a resolution and work might and main to bring Russia and the United States together on this so that we do get a political process in Syria, as well, of course, as the removal of chemical weapons, which was done after 2013 when Lavrov and Kerry reached an agreement which had a big effect. After all, several hundred tons of chemical weapons were destroyed as a result of that process. It can be done, it's hard work, and it takes patience, but surely that is better than the danger of escalation of this conflict into a proxy war between the US and Russia over the skies of Syria.
You mentioned the OPCW there, the Organisation for Prevention of Chemical Weapons. Now, do you accept that when they reported last year that Assad was responsible for a chemical attack in 2017, they were right?
I've no problem with their reporting, their investigation, or the quality of it, but they must be given the chance to do it now. There is evidence, of course, very strong evidence, about the use of chlorine, which is not itself a banned substance because it's so easy to make, but clearly as a weapon it is illegal. That has been used by a number of parties in the conflict, but there's quite clear evidence there. The OPCW must be given the chance to report on it. They are, after all, on their way to doom, and they may even be there now.
They are there now, I think, and we've got reports in the papers of the smell of chlorine coming from the clothes of children and so forth.
So.
If they came back and said, yes, this was Assad's regime, there was one helicopter above it, and this was a chemical attack against international law, would you then be in favour of using missiles too?
I would then say, confront Assad with that evidence, confront any other group that may be fingered because of that, maybe, I'm saying maybe, I don't know, and then say they must now come in and remove and destroy those weapons, as they did in 2013 and 2015. But the wider context has to be promotion of a political solution and a ceasefire. We cannot go on. 400,000 people have died in Syria. 2 million are external refugees.
But nobody died as a result of these attacks, and they may have degraded Assad's chemical weapons facilities really substantially.
There may be other ones we don't know about. There may be a fallout from it. But the point is also of the legality of doing it. Because if we want to get the moral high ground around the world, as a member of the Security Council, as a country with a long tradition of international involvement, shall we say, then we have to abide by international law. And I say to the Foreign Secretary, I say to the Prime Minister, where is the legal basis for this? The legal basis would have to be...
humanitarian, they say.
Well, it would have to be self-defence or the authority of the UN Security Council. The humanitarian intervention is a legally debatable concept at the present time. And I would have thought, from the point of recalling Parliament or waiting 2 days, things could have been different. But it looked awfully to me as though the Prime Minister was more interested in following Donald Trump's lead than anything else. And this is policy made up by Twitter.
We're not in favour of that. Are there any circumstances at all in which you would favour firing missiles at Syria? Any circumstances?
I can only countenance involvement in Syria if there's a UN authority behind it, and that's why I want to say this. If we could get to the process in the UN where you get to a ceasefire, you get to a political solution, you then may well get to a situation where there could be a UN force established to enforce that ceasefire. That surely would save a lot of lives. At the moment, everybody's pouring arms into Syria. There are 12 countries involved in the war in Syria, and there are, as I said, 400,000 dead already.
But there was a UN international mechanism for looking at the responsibility of different groups for chemical weapons attacks, and that no longer exists because the Russians vetoed it last year. They vetoed UN resolutions on this 6 times now. There is no reason to think they'll all stop.
Both sides have either vetoed or threatened to veto. There obviously has not been agreement. But
so listen, the UN is kind of paralysed in this.
Paralysed is too easy a word and is really a counsel of despair. Antonio Guterres is alarmed by what's going on. And what he said on Friday, I think, was very prescient. He said, we're in danger of recreating the Cold War between Russia and the United States in Syria. He asked for and appealed to all powers to do something and come together. Surely the killing has to stop, a ceasefire has to come into place, and it's in the hands partly of us, but particularly of Russia and the United States at the UN to promote that.
Can I put it to you, there's something slightly strange going on here.
Strange?
You are against the use of missiles against Syria under all circumstances, and out there, public opinion is broadly speaking on your side. You have a reputation for being a plain speaker in these subjects. Can you not just say, I'm against using missiles against Syria under all circumstances? It's always wrong.
I've made it very clear that the use of missiles anywhere has consequential effects. What is presented on media and is often fed in by defence departments all around the world is that it's all surgical, clean, it all over. Well, unfortunately, the world isn't quite like that. The longer-term effects are of other people that are killed, are of other people that are affected by it, and, of course, look at the history of this world. Ever since 2001, we've had all these wars, we've had a growth of terrorism, we've had a growth of instability. Surely we've got to start looking at things in a different way.
Trump said he is locked and loaded to carry on this. Do you think we are still at a point where we could see a real, genuine hot war between Russia and the West?
Well, President Trump has a way with words, that's for sure. I hope it's just exaggeration on his part. Well, quite clearly, any country that's deeply involved in Syria could cause an awful lot more trouble now if they wanted to. I hope that President Trump will listen to wise counsels, listen also to wise counsels outside the USA, and pick up the phone to Putin and talk.
OK. You mentioned the UN just now. 2015, there was a motion to send missiles elsewhere. It had UN backing, and you still voted against it.
Yes, I was not...
So it's not the UN that's the issue?
Well, the issue was, what would the effect be of it? Would it, in fact, spawn something worse? Would it kill civilians? And was there another way of doing it, such as cutting off the supply of finance and the supply of arms to ISIS? Now, remember, our exports that go to Saudi Arabia, for example, end up killing people in the Yemen, but also end up somewhere in very bad hands in Syria and other places. We've got to think through what we promote as policy. Absolutely.
2014, another motion in the House of Commons about the use of air power, in this case against ISIS in Syria, Iraq, and again you vote against. Emily Thornberry votes the other way, but as a result of that, surely ISIS has been defeated. It was air power that defeated ISIS, you were against it and you were therefore wrong.
Well, the point I was making was, on whose side were we getting involved? And at the end of the day, ISIS was going to be confronted by ground forces, and it was, from Kurdish people and other forces.
Who have won.
Fortunately, ISIS is no longer the power it was, but some of the other groups that are part of various forms of opposition in Syria are not far away from ISIS in their approach to the world.
But given that these people who are throwing gay men off buildings, were beheading and all the rest of it, have been defeated, surely your vote against that was wrong.
Of course they... No, I'm not saying it was wrong at all. What I'm saying is a process that involves cutting off arms and money that can be used to kill wholly innocent people has got to be there, because the arms and the money are still flowing into the region, albeit now to probably slightly different groups.
But if you were Prime Minister, you would never, ever authorise the use of force against countries.
No one would ever say never. What I would say is...
Almost never, though.
Well, no, what I would say is there has to be a process where the objective is to bring about peace, to bring about a resolution to conflict, to bring about a political solution. Listen, there's going to be no military winner in Syria. Well, the war could go on and get worse, and the killing will get worse. Many people say that
Assad has effectively won that civil war. He's mopping up opposition in different parts of the country, but he has basically won.
But the hatred and the desperation of many people in Syria who are not supporters of Assad, maybe not even supporters of other groups, is going to be there for a long time. The Kurdish people...
Meanwhile, he's in charge.
The Kurdish people need to have their identity. Other groups in this diverse country need to have their identity. Surely, there has to be a role for the United Nations. That's why the UN was founded.
One final historical question, because 2013 there was a similar kind of suggestion that we would go to war with Assad, we'd remove some of his chemical weapons, and the Labour Party again stopped that happening. 2013, he was much weaker. He might have lost that war. He's now much, much stronger. Surely there should be some embarrassment or even shame on the part of the Labour Party that that attack didn't happen when it was still possible to stop this terrible man doing what he's been doing to his people ever since.
Ed Miliband and others made the point then, as I do now, that there has to be a political process to bring about the end of the war. What we said was, go for the political answer now, rather than allow the war to get worse and so many more die as a result of it. Surely, we are an experienced nation, we have great skills and abilities. Can't we use those abilities to save life?
Let me turn to a related subject. You have now seen the intelligence on the Skripal attack in Salisbury. You've seen all the private stuff, and you've heard about the Russians testing out this nerve agent on door handles and pursuing the Skripals, cyber tracking them for 5 years now. Do you accept now that this was a state-sponsored attempt to kill them?
I want to see incontrovertible evidence of it.
And you still haven't?
I want to see incontrovertible evidence of it. I am appalled and alarmed at the idea that anyone would use this nerve agent, and clearly it was an attempt to murder the Skripals on British soil. That is obviously absolutely wrong. The OPCW's job is to identify what the agent was, and they've done that. Sadly, it's not their job to identify who made it or necessarily where it was made. And I do think we need to strengthen the role of the OPCW in the future.
Do you seriously think there is any doubt about who is responsible for this?
I think it's very clear that the nerve agent itself is very similar to those that have been made in Russia. Novichok is what we call it. And obviously there has to be some challenge to Russia on this, and that is what is going on. And I would obviously want to challenge the Russians on the production of this, as indeed I would any other country that's producing something which is wholly and totally illegal.
Do you agree or disagree with John McDonnell, then, who said that this was a state-sponsored assassination attempt?
Well, what I would say is, if we're going to make a very, very clear assertion like that, we've got to have the absolute evidence to do it. Because, listen, we believe in a rules-based diplomacy. We believe in a rules-based international relationship. Therefore, you've got to have absolutely incontrovertible evidence. Otherwise, you reduce your ability to criticise people.
I mean, the government would say we have got that evidence and we have shown it to Jeremy Corbyn and he's still not convinced. What more can we do?
Well, assertions and probabilities are not the same as certainty.
There's no certainty in anything in life, but given what we know, surely the Russians are almost certain to have done this and that therefore there has to be some kind of consequence from that.
I'm very clear of where the origins of this nerve agent came from. I'm very clear that has been this nerve agent produced in Russia. What I'm saying is the OPCW must have the chance and the opportunity to identify, and also it should have the powers, and I think we should give them the powers to identify the source and the culpability of it. At the moment, they don't have that. The OPCW is a very important organisation for the safety of all of us, you and me included.
Let's turn to one other issue, which is CHOGM, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting coming up very, very soon now in this country. It's been suggested that this is the right moment for the British government to apologise to the rest of the Commonwealth for some of the wrongs and errors they have made in the mistake when it comes to the Chagos Islands, when it comes to apartheid and other things. Do you think this is something that now needs to happen?
I think it's very important that Britain recognises its historical role in many of these issues. I mean, for example, the treatment of people in Kenya during the uprising in the 1950s. There's been a sort of apology given on that. On the Chagos Islands, it's an issue I've been very closely involved in for a very long time. That is going to come up at CHOGM, no question about that. And I think it's important that the British government just recognise what Britain did, the Chagos Islanders, was immoral, was wrong and brutal. Put it right, and it'll give them their right of return. And so
this is
I think
for a general reset, if you like.
Well, I think the Commonwealth needs to have a more robust freedom in order to have those debates and those discussions. It is a unique organisation because it represents nations all across the world, all of whom have some kind of relationship with the British colonial past. But I like the Commonwealth. I want us to be involved in it, and I want to have a discussion with Parisha Scotland and others about how we might develop a Commonwealth education programme. But you think of the history children learn in India, the history children learn in this country, they can learn a lot from each other.
And is the Prince of Wales the appropriate person to take over as head of the Commonwealth?
Well, I think the Commonwealth ought to really get a chance to decide who its own head is in the future. The Queen clearly is personally very committed to the Commonwealth, but after her, I think maybe it's a time to say, well, actually, the Commonwealth should decide who its own president is on a rotational basis. I'm looking forward to meeting quite a lot of people from the Commonwealth during the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting.
We've talked a lot about evidence and allegations in this conversation. The Russians, Lavrov is saying that what happened in Syria and what happened in Salisbury were both British government provocations. They were essentially staged by the British government. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I'm quite surprised by them, and
by the events, or the
well, I'm surprised, appalled by the events, and surprised by his comments on it. I mean, that's a pretty big assertion to make. He's either got to back that up or withdraw it.
Jeremy Corbyn, thanks very much indeed for talking to us today. Despite President Trump's blood-curdling threats, when the missile attack came on Syria, it was carefully targeted and less devastating than many expected. Most of the target sites were reportedly evacuated beforehand. So what really were we trying to achieve? And is President Trump now right when he says mission accomplished? The Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, is with me. I guess that's the crucial... Good morning. That is the crucial question. What was the mission, and have we really accomplished it?
There's one overwhelming reason why this was the right thing to do, and that is to deter the use of chemical weapons, not just by the Assad regime, but around the world. And I think one of the most distressing things about the events of the last few years has been the growth, the contemptuous growth in the use of chemical weapons in the Syrian theatre of conflict. And you can imagine that people around the world are looking now and saying, well, finally, someone stood up against that. And the world said enough to the use of such weapons. It's one of the great achievements of the modern world that we've banned chemical weapons. 100 years, virtually, that prohibition has been there, and now the UK, France, America have stepped forward to vindicate that.
But it's also clear that because we had to warn the Russians in advance of what we were doing, so we didn't kill lots of Russians and start World War III, they will have told Assad he has moved stuff out. Do you think he still has weapons capability of that nature?
I can't answer that question. Clearly, the strikes were successful on 3 important sites, but the overwhelming purpose, the mission, was to send a message that after years now in which we've seen a series of chemical weapons strikes, 4 of them, by the way, authenticated by the OPCW Joint Investigative Mechanism, dozens of other attacks of which we have testimony. Finally, the world has said enough is enough. And I think it's important to understand the limits of what we're trying to do. This
is
not
trying
about
to end the war.
That's right, Andrew. And I think that this is not going to, we must be honest, this is not going to turn the tide of the conflict in Syria. One can hope that it encourages the Russians to get Assad to the negotiating table in Geneva, to get a political process properly going. But that is as it were, an extra. The primary purpose is to say no to the use of barbaric chemical weapons.
And I want to come directly back to that. But before we do, I guess the question on a lot of people's lips today is that it now? Because President Trump has talked about being locked and loaded. Are we locked and loaded if Assad uses chemical weapons in a week's time or a month's time or 3 months' time? Will we do the same thing again? Is this the beginning of a process or is it the end of something?
Well, we must hope that it is a deterrent. Obviously, that's of course. And I believe it's been a successful mission. I believe it's a timely, appropriate and commensurate mission. We can't tell.
But if in 3 weeks we get a chemical attack,
we can't tell how the Assad regime will respond. I believe it was the right response to what happened in Duma. The evidence was overwhelming, as your as people were discussing just now on your show,
Sunday Times, yeah.
On the Sunday Times. The smell of chlorine, the sight of that regime helicopter in the air. No one else has helicopters. No one else would be capable of dropping a barrel bomb of chlorine in that way. The evidence was absolutely overwhelming. It was timely. It was proportionate. And to get to the legal question, it will, I believe, if we can, if it acts
there is
as
a genuine debate about this, isn't there?
If it acts as a deterrent, which I hope it will, it can alleviate further humanitarian suffering.
But if the Assad household, an unlikely thought, is watching this programme and they want to know if they use chemical weapons again, will they face other attacks? Well,
there is no proposal on the table at the moment for further attacks because so far, thank heavens, the Assad regime has not been so foolish as to launch another chemical weapons attack. If and when such a thing were to happen, then clearly, with allies, we would study what the options were.
Now, I think the other thing that's worried a lot of people around the country is we were so close to the Russians in all of this. Russian submarines were tracking our submarines. Russian troops were very, very close to some of the places we might have attacked and so forth. I know the hotline was going between Trump and Putin, but nonetheless, how close did we get to a confrontation with the Russians? Are you also worried about how serious and dangerous this is now getting?
Well, I think it was very important for everybody to communicate very, very clearly to the Russians, to the Iranians, to the Assad regime, what this was about. This was about chemical weapons. This was about 3 particular sites. This was about our determination to send a signal, to act as a deterrent. And yes, it was sensible, therefore, to have conversations and to deconflict as far as
so we told the Russians what we were going to do.
I can't say operationally exactly what the contacts were, but it was very important for them in the current understandably strained relations post-Salisbury between us and Russia, for them to understand the limits of what we're trying to do. So this is not about regime change, as you say. It's not about trying to turn the tide of the conflict in Syria. It's the world sending a signal about the use of chemical weapons. We've seen the erosion of that taboo taking place in the last 5-7 years. We've got to stop that erosion. We've got to re-erect the boundary in human psychology against the use of chemical weapons. And you've been very
clear that that is what this was about and nothing else. So to be absolutely clear, Assad, who seems to be winning the war, more or less mopping up opposition at this point, can carry on killing people with barrel bombs and machine guns and bombs of all kinds as long as he doesn't use chemical weapons.
I'm afraid that is the unhappy corollary of this, that if we say that we are limiting our action to chemical weapons, our particular desire to reinforce that prohibition, which is what this is all about, then yes, of course it follows that the rest of the Syrian war must proceed as it will. And there's no doubt about what you say. Assad is determined to butcher his way to a kind of Carthaginian peace in Syria. It would be a great thing if the Russians, and it's only the Russians, I'm afraid, not the Americans, alas, but only the Russians, if the Russians put the pressure on him to come to the negotiating table in Geneva.
Have you spoken to Mr. Lavrov since this happened?
I'm afraid to say that contacts with the Russians have not been good, but there is a regular discussion at, as you can see, at the P5 level in the UN Security Council.
Because again, a lot of people would say this is the moment, above all, for the British government and the Russian government to start negotiations, start talking again properly.
Yes, and well, as I say, there are abundant contacts at the military, at the security level, and as you'll have seen on the TV in the P5 in New York. And we get our points over to the Russians. They understand very clearly where we're coming from. And so when it came to this particular action, there's been no doubt we were making clear to Russia what we were trying to achieve and what we were not trying to achieve.
Mr. Lavrov has suggested that Britain faked these attacks, that Britain was also responsible in some sense for faking what happened in Salisbury.
Yes.
All these allegations are coming out. Does that make it impossible for you to have a conversation with him?
No. We will continue to engage with Russia. Of course, that's right. I was struck that your previous guest did not seek to dismiss these suggestions with quite the
vigour,
quite the vigour that you might have expected, since it is plainly an utterly preposterous and deranged suggestion to say that either that Britain was involved in what happened in Salisbury, which is blatantly offensive, or that we were somehow involved in what happened in Duma, which is absolutely demented.
Looking at the timing of what's happened, a lot of people are asking themselves whether the hurry to make these attacks was to avoid having a Commons vote before they happened.
No, I don't believe that it can be sustained at all. I think the imperative clearly was to get something done that was balanced, that was proportionate, that was effective, and in degrading Assad's chemical weapons capability. But in doing it in such a way as to protect the security of our armed services, to enable them to do it with the dispatch and efficiency that they need. And there is abundant precedent, there is abundant, as you know, the Cabinet Manual and the doctrine of the prerogative power makes it absolutely clear that the NSC had a discussion, the Cabinet had a discussion, and as you know, the Prime Minister will be making a statement in the House of Commons tomorrow, which will be an opportunity for parliamentarians to hold the executive to account on this matter.
Jeremy Corbyn says that he would like a debate and a vote. Would you welcome that?
Well, as I say, the Prime Minister is going to be making a full statement tomorrow. I know that the Speaker tends to allow virtually everybody who wants to make their point, to ask a question, to intervene in such a matter, to have their say. There will be abundant time for people to get their points of view across.
But if the opposition use their parliamentary powers for an emergency debate followed by a vote, would the government oppose that?
That will be a matter for the usual channels and for the Speaker and for parliamentarians to decide. Well, let's see what the opposition propose.
All right, let's turn to back to the Skripal poisoning case.
Yes.
The evidence has been suggested being very, very strong. We heard the interview from the head of Porton Down when he was less categorical, perhaps, than we expected about the origins of the Novichok. You were much criticised for an interview you gave to German television in which you said you'd had absolute categorical assurances from Porton Down. What exactly did you mean?
Yes, well, thank you for asking that, because this happened over Easter, as I recall. And I was being very clear, I thought I was being very clear to Deutsche Welle, the German programme, which is that Porton Down told us in absolutely no uncertain terms that this was a military-grade Novichok.
So they knew what it was. They didn't
and furthermore, of a type that had been produced and stockpiled in the former Soviet Union. And I said, is that really, are you sure about that? And they said they were absolutely certain that that was what it was. Now, it is not the business of Porton Down, and I don't know whether it's even possible for them to identify the origin of any more than you might be able to identify the origin of a sample of sulfuric acid. But as the OPCW confirmed just last week, it was indeed military-grade Novichok of a type that, as I said to you on your show a while back, had been stockpiled likely for assassination purposes by Russia in the last 10 years.
And had you seen the evidence about all the allegations from the security services about it being tested on door handles and the Skripals being pursued for 5 years as well?
At that stage, we hadn't seen that particular piece of evidence, which has only emerged, as you know, in the last few days from the National Security Advisor. But it is quite extraordinary in view of the weight of evidence now. Novichok used in assassination attempts on door handles, the hacking of Yulia Skripal's mobile phone. To continue to deny the likelihood of Russian involvement, of state-sponsored assassination attempt, I think is quite extraordinary, and a sort of a blindness to reality that I find very, very perplexing. A sort of defiant refusal to accept that the Kremlin could be responsible.
We're getting into subordinate clauses here. What I was going to ask you is that this has taken us to a point where our relationship with Russia is as bad, probably, as it ever was during the Cold War. People have been talking about 1963 and the confrontation over the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it being of that order. What is the way back from here?
I think it's a very important point. And look, don't be any doubt, it's not something that we relish, any more than I relish the use of military strikes in Syria by the UK, the US and France. No one wants to do this. We had to do this to reinforce the point about chemical weapons. With Russia, I went to Moscow in December. We held out the hand of engagement. We want to engage with Russia. Of course we do. But I'm afraid that the Russians give us every possible signal and evidence that we also have to beware. And that, I'm afraid, is the reality.
Are you concerned by some of the things they are now saying after these strikes in Syria about there being some kind of revenge attacks? We'll talk about our NHS facilities, our electrical facilities being vulnerable to Russian cyber attack. Are you concerned about that?
I think we have to take every possible precaution. And when you look at what Russia has done, not just in this country, in Salisbury, but the attacks on TV stations, on the democratic processes, on critical national infrastructure, of course we have to be very, very cautious indeed. But I want to stress, we in the UK, do not seek an escalation. Absolutely not. That was why it was so important to get our message over to Russia, over to everybody involved, that our response is limited to saying no to chemical weapons. CHOGM, the Commonwealth Heads of Government Conference, is coming up very shortly. It's been suggested that this is a moment for the British government to start to apologise for some of the wrongs that we perpetrated as British states over the years to other Commonwealth countries. Do you agree with that? Well, that hasn't been suggested to me by any Commonwealth leader, foreign minister or Sherpa of the summit that I've met so far. Nobody has yet come up with this brilliant proposal. I think it may have emanated from the Labour Party, unless I missed my...
It may have
emanated from the Labour Party. But anyway, it's not a proposal that, as I understand, carries much support amongst the 53. And it's going to be a great summit. It's going to be... You've got countries of some of the fastest growing economies in the world, 2.4 billion people, and we're going to have I think it will be a great opportunity for us to rebuild old friendships.
And would you like to see the Prince of Wales taking over as head of the Commonwealth in due course?
That is a matter for the 53 to decide.
Not for you. Finally, you'll have seen Patrick Stewart perhaps earlier on saying that there's going to be this new campaign, The People's Vote, to bring back, and it seems perfectly reasonable, to bring back the terms that have been negotiated, the actual deal, nothing unspecific, nothing vague, nothing hypothetical, the real deal, and let people vote on the real deal. You know, why not? Why not?
I mean, people had a vote, it was a great vote, and they voted with a substantial majority to leave the EU. We're now trying to deliver on that mandate from the people. I think we'll get a great result, and we'll be able to not only have a gigantic free trade deal with our friends and partners across the Channel, but to adapt to Patrick. He had something to do with Star Wars, didn't he? We'll be able to boldly go again. We'll be able to boldly go again to areas that perhaps we've neglected over the last
full of dangerous alien spacecraft waiting to zap us.
No, on the contrary, friendly, wonderful places where we can renew old friendships, rebuild relationships, and develop fantastic new free trade deals. And a lot of that is going to be on the table at the Commonwealth Summit next week.
Foreign Secretary, thanks very much indeed for talking to us.
But first, we can head to Glasgow now and speak to the Scottish First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. First Minister, very good morning to you.
Good morning.
You will have had time now to review the strikes themselves, the way in which they were conducted, and indeed some further rationale being provided by the Americans and the French. In the light of all of that, do you believe that we were wrong to strike Bashar al-Assad's chemical weapons? Yes, I do. And for me, the big question is, do isolated airstrikes do anything at all to alleviate the acute humanitarian suffering in Syria, which predates the chemical attack last week? And do isolated airstrikes do anything to take Syria a single step forward towards long-term peace? This is a complex, multi-layered conflict that's now in its 8th year, as well as the civil war in Syria. We see proxy conflicts involving not just America and Russia, but countries like Iran and Turkey and Israel, Saudi Arabia. This is a complicated situation, and I don't believe isolated airstrikes will help resolve that. It hasn't done so in the past. The airstrike on the airbase carried out by the United States round about a year ago, within hours, Syrian warplanes were taking off from that airbase again. What we need is a long-term international approach, not just action that perhaps makes Western leaders feel as if they're doing something. But I have to say, and I don't doubt that these are difficult decisions for the Prime Minister, but what happened on Friday night into Saturday morning felt as if it was more to do with some kind of macho strongman standoff between Trump and Putin, and that should not be the role of UK foreign policy. As you say, First Minister, the situation in Syria is complicated, ridiculously complicated, and it is certainly perfectly arguable that those airstrikes don't take us a step closer to peace, but they surely do take us a step back from the prospect of Assad using chemical weapons against his people again. Well, I don't know that that's the case, and certainly, I hope that the Prime Minister sets out much more detail of what her strategy is and what she considers to have been achieved by the airstrikes. But as well as not necessarily taking Syria a single step closer to peace, there is a real danger, and this is an extremely serious point, that airstrikes such as those we saw over the weekend risk, I think, further escalating an already dangerous situation. And we've heard similar concerns expressed by the United Nations Secretary-General. And that, I think it's important to stress that the conflict in Syria, it's a complicated civil war, but we see standoffs between a range of other countries, proxy conflicts being waged in Syria as well. So there is a danger that action that is taken hastily, action that doesn't necessarily contribute to peace, actually risks not just escalating the civil war, but escalating the tensions internationally as well. So this, I think, makes it all the more important that leaders take the time to set out their objectives and strategies carefully. I think in a UK context, it is absolutely essential that Parliament is involved. We shouldn't forget that the UK's active engagement in Syria right now was authorised by Parliament in terms of the authority for targeted attacks against Daesh. Now, for the role of UK armed forces to be changed without the approval of Parliament, I think is a serious mistake, and I hope that we see over the next 24-48 hours a full debate in the House of Commons, not just a statement by the Prime Minister, and a commitment that if there was to be any further action, that has to be authorised and sanctioned by a vote in the House of Commons. Can I just be absolutely clear as to your position about the involvement in the Commons and all of this? Are you arguing that the Prime Minister has a responsibility, a legal responsibility, to come to the Commons before declaring military action? It seems to me that there are clearly going to be cases where all of the intelligence cannot be shared with the members of the House of Commons, and indeed there will be situations in which military action needs to be taken quickly without prevarication and debate. I accept all of that, and I accept there will be situations, for example, where there is a clear self-defence element where that is the case. I also accept that not all of the intelligence can be shared with the House of Commons. That was the case in previous votes of the House of Commons, and I think there would be a widespread acceptance of that. But, if we cast our minds back to the debacle over the Iraq war, one of the few positives to come out of that was the establishment of the practice that military action should ordinarily be approved and sanctioned by the House of Commons. And I think what we've seen over the weekend is a step back from that, and I think that is deeply regrettable. Now, we can't undo what has been done, but I think it is important that if there is to be any further change to the engagement of UK forces in Syria, that the House of Commons should be asked to sanction that. There's a wider point here as well. Clearly, if the Prime Minister is confident in the approach she wants to take, confidence in the intelligence that underpins that and the evidence that underpins that, and we should remember that the
chemical weapons inspectors are only now starting their work in Syria. But if there is a confidence in the position that the Prime Minister is taking, then setting out that clearly in the House of Commons, getting the House of Commons behind her, would actually strengthen her position, not weaken it.
Well, it would strengthen her position politically. It would weaken her position in terms of military strategy, wouldn't it? I mean, if we're talking about taking out chemical weapon sites in Syria, there is a finite amount of them, probably a handful only. Any advance knowledge given to the Syrians that we are debating a military strike, I mean, surely that just gives them the opportunity to exit stage left.
I think the logical conclusion of the argument you're putting to me there would, have raised deep concerns about the nature of our democracy. I don't think we should see the involvement of the democratically elected Parliament of the country in decisions like this as a sign of weakness. Indeed, I think it would be the sign of a strength of democracy. I think everybody, and certainly I, accept that not all detail either of intelligence or of the military strategy should be shared. But asking Parliament for the sanction for the broad objectives and the engagement of UK forces, I think, is something that should be done. I think it should have been done. We can't turn the clock back, but I certainly think that should be done in future. And in terms of the Prime Minister making a statement to the House of Commons tomorrow, I would hope that becomes a full parliamentary debate. These are really serious issues. Nobody, not least me, is doubting the fact that Assad is a brutal dictator with no regard for his own population. We don't yet have the evidence from the chemical weapons inspectors, but I have no difficulty whatsoever in believing that Assad is capable of launching a chemical attack on his own population. The question here is what course of action is best placed to alleviate humanitarian suffering that has been deepening in recent times, not least in eastern Ghouta in Syria, and what takes Syria closer to peace. We have a Security Council resolution passed earlier this year, Resolution 2401, calling for ceasefires to allow the alleviation of humanitarian suffering. We need to see a coordinated international effort towards getting peace in Syria. It's only a few weeks since President Trump was saying that it wouldn't be long before US forces were leaving Syria, and now, of course, we see airstrikes. We need to see commitment from the international community towards peace. Isolated airstrikes may have the semblance of action. It may make Western leaders feel as if they're doing something, but I don't believe, just as they haven't in the past, I don't believe they contribute towards a long-standing and lasting peace in Syria, which is what that country and its population so badly needs.
Ms Sturgeon, I mean, are you suggesting that you doubt the assessment of the British government, the American government, the French government, that those airstrikes were surgical in their precision, that they have had a seismic effect on Assad's ability to deploy chemical weapons against his own people, and on that basis are justified?
Well, look, I'm not privy to all of the information. I will listen carefully to all of the information.
How much information would you need? I mean, honestly, we had heard of this event. The intelligence communities of those three nations, again saying chemical weapons were used. All of the available evidence suggests that Assad was responsible. And after the fact, we have the intelligence communities of those three nations suggesting that those military strikes were effective in limiting his ability to use chemical weapons. Where is your problem with the way in which USA, France, and the United Kingdom have operated?
The point I'm making is we've seen airstrikes in the past that supposedly have depleted Assad's ability to launch chemical strikes. That hasn't turned out to be the case. A year ago, the United States launched an attack on Syria Air Base in Syria, supposedly to deplete the Syrian Air Force's ability. Within hours, there were Syrian warplanes flying from that air base. My point is there is a bigger question here, not just about the depletion of the Syrian capability, but how we take Syria overall towards a sustainable peace. And the question about whether airstrikes in an isolated basis can do that, I think, is a very serious question. Now, let the Prime Minister come to the House of Commons, lay out her strategy in full, and then allow a full debate with a vote as appropriate on the back of that. We all, I think the point of unity here has to be that we want to see Assad stopped from carrying out the kinds of attacks on his own population that we know he is capable of doing, but we also want to see the situation in Syria being resolved. This is a situation
no one doubts that, and no one wants the situation to not be resolved. The problem is this. Surely there are all of the other options. Indeed, but all of the other options on the table, bringing in the inspectors again, they've been in, they've said there were chemical weapons used 4 times before, nothing has changed. Go to the United Nations, every time we do that, the Russians use their veto. Bring all the parties together round the table for talks, that failed in Geneva. I mean, what is the plan? You're talking about a plan, but I'm not hearing the detail of it.
Well, let me answer that in several parts. Firstly, you say the Security Council action always fails. There was a Security Council resolution passed a matter of weeks ago, Resolution 2401, that calls for a ceasefire, particularly in areas in eastern Ghouta, to allow humanitarian suffering to be alleviated, to allow civilians to come out. But that's my point. I don't think there has been the concerted patient effort by the international community, and we've heard the UN envoy to Syria, Staffan de Mistura, talk about this in recent weeks. There needs to be a real commitment behind those efforts. There's also further action that can be taken in terms of the chemical weapons programme in Syria, the research centre in Syria that develops the chemical weapons programme. I think there is more action that could be taken to disrupt its supply chains, to disrupt the transport to and from it, to apply sanctions against some of the key personnel in that research centre. There are very few of these individuals subject to UK sanctions. There are actually more subject to US sanctions. So when I hear the Prime Minister saying there's no practical alternative, I would question whether that is really the case, and also question the efficacy of isolated airstrikes when it comes to a long-term sustainable peace. And these are serious matters that I don't think are helped by action being taken with the UK Parliament being sidelined. Let's have full, proper debate about how UK foreign policy and UK action, if that is to be used, if the terms of engagement of UK forces is to be changed, then let us have confidence and a consensus behind that being in the interests of the overall long-term move to peace in Syria.
I mean, do you, First Minister, do you believe wholeheartedly in the kind of the doctrine of humanitarian intervention? I mean, it does strike me that there is perhaps a fundamental hypocrisy on the part of the West, and I include politicians, you know, opposed to airstrikes and those in favour of airstrikes, which is there's an awful lot of hand-wringing in London and Washington and Paris every time that we see chemical weapons being used. But at the same time, you know, hundreds of thousands of people have died, civilians have died through the use of conventional weapons. We seem to hate seeing, you know, pictures of children dead foaming at the mouth, but we don't seem to be that concerned about the fact that, you know, many of them have been killed using flechette rounds, for example.
Absolutely. Well, you know, firstly, if we take the humanitarian alleviation as the legal ground for action that was set out in the UK summary of the legal advice yesterday, I mean, I think just as a matter of fact, there is not international consensus behind that as a legal basis for the kind of action we've seen. The only
Security Council seemed okay with
grounds. Well, let me just say the two clear-cut legal grounds, of course, are UN resolutions or self-defence. But there is hypocrisy on the part of the West. If there is going to be a humanitarian intervention ground for action like this, then there is a need for some consistency to be developed in terms of how that kind of principle is applied. We've seen humanitarian suffering in Gaza, in Yemen, the plight of the Rohingya Muslims more recently. There needs to be consistency, because if that consistency is not there, then the danger is we deepen the suspicion and the cynicism about the reasons why Western countries take action. But it also means that I think it is all the more important to build consensus around the kind of action that is to be contemplated. The problem, I think, with taking the kind of action that was seen in Friday night into Saturday morning is that there are these questions over the efficacy, there are questions over the consensus behind it, and rather than building international consensus around a coordinated approach to resolving a situation and alleviating the humanitarian suffering, which should be a priority in all of that, what we do, albeit I am prepared to accept on the part of the Prime Minister inadvertently, is we risk escalating an already complicated situation.
First Minister, many thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Let's stick with the topic of Syria and head up the road to Leeds, old stomping ground of mine, in fact, where we can speak to Labour's Shadow Justice Secretary, Richard Burgon. Mr Burgon, very good morning to you. Was Theresa May wrong
morning, Neil,
to carry out those airstrikes against chemical weapons in Syria?
Taking a country to war is the most serious decision a Prime Minister can take, and that's why it's very, very regrettable that she didn't allow Parliament to have a debate on it and didn't allow Parliament to have a vote on it before she took that action. What is clear is that from the opinion polls, there isn't widespread public support for this military action. So if the test is on a Prime Minister to only go to war with parliamentary support and with public support, then in that sense the Prime Minister's failed both tests. And I do remember Robin Cook, a great parliamentarian, and when he spoke against the Iraq war, sadly he wasn't successful in persuading Parliament not to back the invasion of Iraq. But on his gravestone it actually says, "I may not have stopped the war, but I established the principle that Parliament would always get to decide on whether we go to war or not." I think it's very sad that it appears that this precedent has been put in place where the Prime Minister doesn't think it's appropriate to wait 2 or 3 days to consult Parliament. And so I think it's very welcome that this morning Jeremy Corbyn talked about a War Powers Act, which would mean that Parliament would have to have a vote on whether or not our country takes military action, goes to war.
I don't want to underplay the significance of a Prime Minister taking the decision to send several jets carrying some very powerful munitions to bomb a foreign country. But at the same time, I mean, that is not an act of war. I mean, if Theresa May is right in her assessment that the strikes that were carried out by ourselves, by the French, by the Americans were limited to chemical weapons sites, and it can be shown that they have limited Bashar al-Assad's ability to use chemical weapons against his own population, what's the problem?
Well, first of all, I would say, with respect, we shouldn't underplay the significance of what the Prime Minister has decided to do. The aeroplanes going to bomb these targets, that is an act of war. To bomb targets in another country is an act of war, and the legality of this is highly questionable, as has been said. But there's going to be no military solution to this brutal and horrific civil war in Syria, which has seen 400,000 killed, millions of refugees. And what we need is Britain to use our standing in the world to ensure that it's not about taking the side of Trump or taking the side of Putin. It's about taking the side of the Syrian people and world peace, and lobbying and putting pressure on through the UN for a peaceful diplomatic solution. Look, for example, in 2013, when through the UN, the USA and Russia made an agreement about destroying chemical weapons capability of Assad, and as a result, hundreds of millions of tons of chemical weapons were destroyed. In contrast, the United States bombed Syria last year in order to stop chemical weapons attacks, and we've got these horrific videos showing a chemical weapons attack just the other week. So it seems to me that when there was an agreement between the United States and Russia in 2013 through the UN, that resulted in destroying hundreds of tons of chemical weapons, which is far more effective.
I mean, there is only one problem with that analysis, Mr. Bergen, and it's the fact that, Bashar al-Assad clearly didn't destroy all of his chemical weapons, despite the agreement of the Russians in all of this. So, I mean, I'll ask the question again. If on Monday, if tomorrow, when Theresa May comes to the House, she can furnish you with evidence that there were no civilian casualties, that the sites that were struck by these weapons, American, French and our own, were targeted at chemical weapons installations, and that this has led to less of a likelihood that Bashar al-Assad will again poison children with chlorine. Surely that should be something that's welcomed.
Well, we need to see what the Prime Minister is going to say to Parliament, and this is why it should be the case that the Prime Minister comes to Parliament before taking such action, because she could have presented her case to Parliament before taking this decision, which I say is the biggest decision that any Prime Minister of any country can make. But let's not pretend there's any easy outcome to this horrific civil war. It's been found out that both Assad and ISIL have used chemical weapons in the Syrian civil war. There is no easy outcome to this, so our priority has to be to minimise the number of casualties, to save lives in Syria, and that's why it sticks in my throat when the Prime Minister has been so quick to take this action of questionable legality without the approval of Parliament to bomb Syria, yet at the same time was so resistant to accepting the Dubs amendments, which would have taken just 3,000 Syrian refugees, children, rather than the 300 which the government admitted, or 350, that they were going to take. We need to put the protection of Syrian civilians at the heart of this. We've also got to understand the international concern that this could escalate. And I think it's really, really worrying that the Prime Minister of our country seems to pay more heed to the Twitter tantrums of Donald Trump than to the British Parliament. That's not good for our democracy, and it creates a very dangerous precedent, which is why the Secretary-General of the UN has spoken out his concern about this step that's been taken over the weekend.
Mr Bergen, can we then focus on this idea that you have? That, I mean, are you honestly saying that you think for any British Prime Minister to take military action would, not necessarily legally at the moment, but in your mind, at every opportunity that they need to take military action, they should first consult the House of Commons?
Parliament could have been recalled last week. The Prime Minister hasn't presented any
I'm sorry to
evidence.
interrupt, but that's not quite my question. Do you think that there are any circumstances in which a British Prime Minister should be allowed to take military action without coming to the House of Commons?
I do think that on this occasion it looks like Parliament has been treated with contempt. It's actually Conservative MPs as well who counselled against Theresa May taking this step before she did. So this isn't a party political point by the Labour Party.
Indeed not, Mr Bergen, and I'm sorry to keep interrupting, but this is a really important point. Is it the Labour Party position that in the future, if you were in government, there would be no military action taken by a Labour government without consulting Parliament?
Well, Jeremy Corbyn today talked about, and I think it's very welcome, bringing in a War Powers Act, which would mean that Parliament would have to have a say on whether or not Britain goes to war. I think that's the right thing to do. I think that's in the interest of our democracy. It's the interest of our standing in the world. If we're going to uphold international law and insist that other people uphold their international obligations, it's also correct that we do so. And what I'm really worried about is the law of unintended consequences. A Conservative MP said on the radio only the day that he was worried that if Theresa May took this action, then unwittingly our brave pilots could end up being, unwittingly, because of the Prime Minister's instruction, in effect the Air Force of ISIL and related forces in Syria. They don't want that to happen. No one wants that to happen. And the law of unintended consequences also applies to escalation. Look at all the powers involved in the civil war in Syria, in this brutal civil war. 12 powers involved there. It could easily spiral even further out of control, with further loss of life in Syria, with further implications for the region and further implications for the wider world. At no point in my adult life have I been as worried about the future of peace in our world.
We have 4 incidences of the OPCW identifying Bashar al-Assad as having used chemical weapons. The very strong likelihood is that it was he who was responsible for the most recent attack. We know that he has killed hundreds and thousands of his own people using conventional weapons. I mean, how much worse could it get? This law of unintended consequences of which you speak, I mean, you know, an unintended consequence of the fact that we've been pushing the peaceful dialogue option is hundreds of thousands of people have died.
Well, we're in a situation where the OPCW, who only arrived yesterday, need to be allowed to do the work. As you say, it's been found that previously Assad has used chemical weapons. It's also been found previously that ISIL and related forces in the Syrian civil war have used chemical weapons. That is abhorrent. It's a war crime. The perpetrators of that need to be brought to justice. But we need to allow the OPCW to do their work. They only arrived yesterday. The bombing had already taken place before that happened. And this isn't going to end the Syrian civil war. This isn't going to end the suffering and carnage of the Syrian people.
Indeed, and that is not the stated purpose, according to Theresa May.
To push for a peaceful solution for that.
Yeah, just in terms of this, though, the OPCW, as I've mentioned before, have identified Bashar al-Assad as having used chemical weapons in the past. The combined intelligence agencies of the United States, the United Kingdom and France identified him as responsible for the most recent incident. Are you saying that if you were given all of that intelligence, if Jeremy Corbyn was sitting in number 10, he was given all of this evidence by his own intelligence community, by the Americans, by the French, that he would still need to get clarification from the OPCW before taking action which, you know, almost certainly would not be military in nature?
Well, I think we need to ensure that the important role of the organisation of the prohibition of chemical weapons isn't undermined. In one part of your question, you referred positively to the work of the OPCW, saying they'd identified previously where chemical weapons had been used and by whom. And then in the second part of your question, you implied that there's no need to wait for them to draw their expert conclusions on this occasion. They arrived yesterday. I was concerned before the bombing took place of this push for Britain to get involved in this way in the Syrian civil war, and I'm still very concerned about that. The action that was taken the other day, and I'm delighted that no British personnel were hurt. I'm delighted that as of yet we've had no evidence that Syrian civilians were harmed or killed as a result of these airstrikes, but the consequences of this are not that the Syrian civil war is going to end. Donald Trump says in a tweet, mission accomplished. It's not as simple as that. You can't just bomb your way to peace from above Cyprus. That's not how this is working. What's shown in the last 7 years is that the Syrian civil war isn't going to have a military solution. We need a peaceful, negotiated solution. And when we've got a Prime Minister that appears to be taking more heed of Donald Trump's tweets than of the British Parliament or the UN or international law, that's not going to help to get the peaceful resolution that the people of Syria, the people of the wider region, and indeed the people all around the world who feel very frightened at the moment need.
Richard Bergen, many thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
I'm very pleased to say, sticking with Syria, the Liberal Democrat leader, Sir Vince Cable, joins me in the studio. Very good morning to you. I'll ask the same question I've been asking of all the politicians this morning. I mean, was Theresa May wrong to carry out those strikes against chemical weapons in Syria?
No, I think what she did, you know, had a basic logic, and I understand the instincts behind it, but I think it was a mistake to do it without getting proper political endorsement at home, without calling Parliament and without getting a vote behind it. I think that was a mistaken judgment. The sense I have of this was taken for reasons of political weakness and of fear that they might lose the vote. But as a result, you know, there's been an action abroad that may or may not prove to have been successful in its own terms, but she's not carried domestic public opinion, and that's rather important as we go forward.
Okay, just explain to me the purpose of having a debate, even before the vote, but having that debate in the House of Commons when all of the intelligence cannot be furnished to those who will cast a vote on it. And as you well know, in Parliament, particularly in the Commons these days, you know, there's an awful lot of partisan behaviour.
Yeah. Well, it's not about Parliament standing on its dignity, and it's not about debate for its own sake. It's about trying to build a consensus at home for very dangerous and difficult things that the government's got to do abroad. Now, this operation so far, we don't know what the consequences will be. We don't know where it's going to lead. We don't know whether it's been a success even in its own terms. But it could go very badly pear-shaped, and under those circumstances, it will be very important for the Prime Minister to have built a consensus at home, which he hasn't done.
But just in terms of the legality of it, you have no qualms, no questions about the legality of the...
No, I'm not quibbling about legality. I mean, of course, law is important, but I'm not a lawyer myself. I rely on other people's advice on this. But certainly, I was in the Cabinet in 2013. We had a situation that was similar. Of course, things have moved on. We had very strong legal advice that what we were doing was legitimate.
Would things have been different had the vote back then have been different?
I think so. I supported the action back in 2013. At that point, the civil war was very far from unresolved. I think an intervention at that point could have made a difference, but the fact that our House of Commons voted against it gave President Obama a reason for not pursuing it. I think it was a mistake and it was unfortunate.
And I think one of the reasons we're in the position today is because action wasn't taken then.
Why is it that the politicians and commentators get so much more exercised by the deployment of chemical weapons against a population than conventional weapons?
Well, it's a good question, because, of course, some conventional weapons, cluster bombs, can do terrible damage. It's just that a line has been drawn around weapons of mass destruction. Of course, chemical weapons are far less damaging than nuclear weapons, but nonetheless, we've seen in the First World War initially, and then subsequently just how horrific are the injuries to both soldiers and civilians. And the decision has been made by the international community that this must stop, and international laws being built around that. And if we believe in any kind of order, and I'm not sure you can introduce humanity into war, but providing some limitations on brutal behaviour, then those lines have to be enforced.
But by any measure, hundreds of thousands of innocent people, of civilians, men, women, children, have been killed by Bashar al-Assad using weapons supplied from a variety of sources, but weapons which are available on the open market. Wasn't there a prima facie case for humanitarian intervention a long time ago in order to stop the slaughter of his own people?
There was, but as we all know, the conflict in Syria has become unbelievably complicated, and you've had vicious people on both sides. You know, you had the Islamic fundamentalists, the ISIS people, and Bashar al-Assad, who was actually fighting them, and innumerable factions and sub-factions. I mean, there wasn't any clearly right or wrong in this issue. But nonetheless, the fundamental point you make is that it's a terrible tragedy. This country has been destroyed, partly because of sectarian conflict, partly because of great power intervention.
Is it now time, perhaps, to stop looking at the United Nations as the place where these terrible, terrible domestic problems are solved? I mean, every time that the Security Council has tried to get action on the ground in Syria, there has been a very, very obvious blockage put in place by the Russians.
Well, I believe in the United Nations. I think the ideal, the principle is absolutely right. And of course, there are many places around the world where you do have blueberries employed. They're not often in very glamorous contexts, but they are keeping the peace between countries and factions that would otherwise be at war. So I do defend it. But of course, in this particular case, the Russians have blocked action through the Security Council.
So why then was it wrong for Theresa May to not give advance warning to Bashar al-Assad of the impending strikes and take that action, particularly when presented with evidence not just from our own intelligence community, but from that of the United States and France?
I'm not disputing the evidence. It seems to me the evidence is absolutely clear-cut that the Syrians committed atrocity. I actually do believe in our intelligence agencies. I think they're professional. I've been in a cabinet, worked with them. I don't have any problems with that. My questioning of the government is to the wisdom of proceeding the way it did without building up a consensus and a case in this country. Could have done, but we need more clarity about what the objectives are. I mean, I still don't know, 24 hours or more after this happened, whether we're just talking about a one-off action that was designed to send a signal, or whether this is part of some sustained campaign. President Trump doesn't seem to know, and we do need absolute clarity about these things.
We do indeed. Well, everyone will turn their attention to the Commons tomorrow. Sir Vince, many thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Bye.
It's a slightly sombre hello from me, because the week has been dominated by this shocking atrocity in Syria and the response of him, and of course her. Because, as you know, they launched an airstrike in the early hours of Saturday morning to wipe out his chemical weapons capacity. They cited the need to avert a humanitarian disaster as the legal basis for the attack, and although it was inevitable that he would condemn them, he too questioned whether the UK, France and the US had in fact broken international law. So, tomorrow in the Commons, she'll be under pressure to say what she thinks she's actually achieved and why she didn't seek the approval of MPs before bombing. The stakes could hardly be higher for her and for us, could they, Allegra Screeney?
No, Robert, she's got a difficult few days ahead. MPs are unhappy that their moment in Parliament tomorrow comes after the bombs have dropped. You can see all front pages going with that moment that they hit Syria. The Mail on Sunday has that Donald Trump line, mission accomplished. Elsewhere, Donald Trump saying it was the perfect mission. Except the Sunday Times have a very striking photograph, lots of papers go with it, here it is from them, of a missile streaking through the sky above Damascus. And then it accompanies this piece by Christina Lamb, a very powerful piece, and she is reporting rebels being moved en masse to the city of Idlib on the Turkish border, where, well, the end game could be nigh for them, that they get pounded by Syrian and Russian missiles. Right, so for many of you out there who are wondering why the UK has joined the strikes now, we hope this graph goes some way towards helping you understand. Up until now, the UK had been worried about striking Syria for fear of only strengthening Islamic State or IS. So these are the strikes by coalition forces against Islamic State. You can see since 2014, lots of them peaking around here. But now, tailing off, and that's because there is a sense that IS is on the back foot. And that is why on Friday night, this little one here, we joined the yellow one. 105 bombs dropped on Friday night, 8 of them British. The first time the UK has attacked a foreign power since Libya in 2011. And of course, it has sparked a very, very fierce debate. Here we have Shadow Home Secretary Diane Abbott putting it succinctly. UK was not under imminent threat. No UN resolution, no parliamentary vote or debate. Can these airstrikes on Syria possibly be legal? Well, one man that thinks that they are is the Housing Minister, Dominic Raab. Back in the day, he was also a Foreign Office lawyer for 6 years, and he says, responding to something that Robert Peston said last night on Twitter, the right of humanitarian intervention has long been relied on, most notably in Kosovo. But you don't agree, do you, Robert?
Well, what my argument is that citing humanitarian reasons for an attack is the most contentious of the 3 justifications for launching this kind of raid. But, Chuka, if I could just start with you. Do you think the Prime Minister was right to bomb these 3 facilities, joining with France and America?
Yes, I do, but I think she should have consulted Parliament first. She could have easily have done that by recalling Parliament at the end of last week. But look, I don't think you should hide behind the inevitable Russian veto at the UN Security Council as an excuse not to act when there are other legal avenues available. And the basis of intervening on humanitarian grounds is well established. Look, international law isn't certain. It isn't certain in the way that domestic law is, so it's always contested. But there was a clear legal basis here. And look, there are consequences in not acting in as much as there are consequences of acting. And here there was a specific, defined military goal, which was to degrade their chemical weapons capacity, which appears to have been achieved. They managed to achieve it, according to both the Russians and the United States, without any fatalities. And ultimately, I suppose the question to those who are against action is, are you prepared to see people violate international norms and use chemical weapons without there being any consequence? And I think, look,
but just to be clear, given that you think it was the right thing to do, why do you care about whether there was a vote in Parliament or not?
Because I think in the wake of the 2003 Iraq action, and I think there is a problem in the sense that whenever you have a foreign intervention using our armed forces, everybody refracts back to Iraq and scribes that situation onto every other situation, which is ridiculous. But one thing it did establish was the convention in a parliamentary democracy like ours that Parliament should at the very least be consulted. Now, sometimes that won't be possible because of the practical urgency and need to act very, very quickly. I don't think in this case you could invoke that. I do think you would have had time to have a proper parliamentary debate before the RAF jets were sent in.
I mean, Nadine, Chuka's right, isn't it? I mean, the clear consensus of MPs during the Gordon Brown premiership, during the coalition, was that MPs should always be consulted before an action of this sort. Theresa May broke what was, in fact, what in practice was a promise to MPs.
I just don't think there was time. First of all, this happened at the end of last week when MPs, I know and Chuka knows, many of them were all over the world on various select committee trips. And it's never easy to recall Parliament overnight because not everybody is in the country. So that would have taken a few days, and it always has taken a few days to recall Parliament.
There was enough time. I mean, look, let's Parliament. Look, the atrocity was last Saturday. It was perfectly clear on the Monday that President Trump was heading in the direction of bombing.
Okay.
There was more than enough time to recall Parliament.
If this was a campaign for a sustained attack, if this was we were going to war, if this was a run of attacks, then yes, I would say that Parliament would need to have been consulted. But on the basis of humanitarian grounds, on the fact that we were responding to what was an atrocious use of chemical weapons, on the basis that we had international coalition with France and America, and now we've got New Zealand and Australia and Canada and various UN institutions all coming out to, European institutions coming out to support what we did. On that basis, I think what the Prime Minister was absolutely right. We responded quickly because we were also
We're going to have a lively
coalition
debate
with
on all
other
this in
countries.
Parliament tomorrow, and I've got lots more to talk to both of you about in just a few minutes. But now I'm delighted to be joined by David Lidington, the Prime Minister's de facto deputy. Very nice to see you, David.
Hey, Robert.
So let's kick off, obviously, with Syria. Are we going to bomb again?
Well, it looks as if the measures that were taken have been effective. Obviously, we're still looking at the results, but we think that we have succeeded in sufficiently degrading and significantly degrading the Assad regime's chemical weapons capability. That was the key objective, to both make it much more difficult for him to use chemical weapons again, to deter him from further use of chemical weapons, which, after all, are things that have been outlawed internationally for nearly a century, and also to deter other countries that might be tempted if the world turned aside when the use of chemical weapons was being normalised by the Assad regime's tactics. So we hope very much that the initial signs are that that degrading of Assad's capacity has been achieved, and it is very clear that, you know, we're not about trying to effect regime change, however much we loathe the Assad regime. This is not the intervention in the Syrian
Well, look, let's come back to the whole
war.
issue of the future of Syria in a second. But, you know, I was at that press conference yesterday that the Prime Minister gave, where she reserved the right to bomb again. Can I just check, if we thought the conditions were appropriate for a second strike, because, as you say, we hadn't degraded that capacity enough and it looked as though Assad was going to use those weapons again, would on that occasion Parliament be consulted?
Well, I think you're sort of piling hypothesis on hypothesis, Robert. I mean, I'm not going to rule anything in or rule anything out about the future, but what we were very clear about is that we had a very carefully defined objective in legal, moral and military terms. We think that that objective has been achieved, that the mission has been successful. We hope very much that the Assad regime will draw the conclusions that we hope from the consequences of that military action, that they will cease the use of chemical weapons, and also that Russia, which is the main backer, the main finance and arms supplier to the Assad regime, will actually use the pressure that they can put upon Damascus to draw back, to observe the ban on the use of chemical weapons that the whole of the world has signed up to. Let's not forget that it's 5 years ago Russia promised to deliver a complete end to the Syrian chemical weapons capacity, and Syria promised to do that. It hasn't happened.
Now, but on this issue, though, of legitimacy of these attacks, you'll remember that Gordon Brown, and indeed the coalition you were a part of, mooted a War Powers Act which would make it obligatory in certain circumstances for MPs to have a vote before military action takes place. Jeremy Corbyn has called for such legislation today. Does he have a point? Do you think there is a case for a War Powers Act?
I think the key constitutional position is that the government of the day, an elected government of the day in Britain, has to have the right to authorise military action in defence of the country's vital national interest, and then be accountable to Parliament. Now,
but just be clear, hang on a second.
Yep.
Nobody would say I mean, the Prime Minister didn't say this was an act of self-defence. You know, she cites humanitarian reasons for this. So,
and if you look at what the coalition government said in establishing a convention about how and when Parliament should be involved, it was made very clear in terms then that there would be occasions where and the explicit examples given for urgent humanitarian relief, that action needed to be taken by a government without going to Parliament first,
why not legislate for that, so that all this debate about the circumstances, about when it's appropriate, when it's not appropriate, the ambiguity could be ruled out?
Because governments are accountable to Parliament, quite right. That's why the Prime Minister is going to be at the dispatch box tomorrow to answer questions for, I suspect, rather a long time from MPs of all parties about this. But also, governments have to bear in mind the need to be able to act swiftly and flexibly and to protect the safety.
So you're against legislation?
Of our servicemen.
Just to be clear, you are against legislation?
We've got no plans for legislation. We need to be able to act to protect the security of servicemen and women whose lives, after all, are at risk when they undertake these missions for us.
Now, on this citing of humanitarian imperative as the reason for bombing, why have we not intervened in Yemen, where the humanitarian catastrophe has, some would say, been even worse than what's been happening in Syria?
We have to look at things on a case-by-case basis. The rationale for the humanitarian justification for intervention goes back to 1998, when the Labour government sort of developed this doctrine in respect of intervention in Kosovo. It was a doctrine that the coalition government accepted as well. It does require three conditions to be very clearly met. First of all, there must be a defined need for urgent humanitarian relief to avoid very significant catastrophic suffering. And the existence of that humanitarian need must be generally accepted by the international community. Second, you've got to be clear that you have exhausted, you've tried any other means and no alternative is available. In this case, we've tried diplomacy, we've tried sanctions, we've tried United Nations Security Council resolutions, which Russia's vetoed every time. And third, you've got to ensure that the action you take is proportionate in scope and proportionate in duration. Those conditions were met
David,
here.
hang on a second. I mean, Assad is still there. He's using despicable weapons, barrel bombs, all sorts of terrible guns and the rest of it against his own citizens. Why limit our intervention to chemical weapons? I mean, there is a humanitarian catastrophe still underway, so why not?
Because the chemical weapons have been outlawed internationally for nearly a century. The dismantling of Syria's chemical weapons capability was something that Assad himself pledged 5 years ago, does not deliver, that Russia pledged to ensure was dismantled, hasn't happened. And what happened in Duma was, let's not forget, we had families who were cowering in cellars to try to avoid conventional bombardment, who were then murdered, I mean, I've used the word advisedly, by the use of chemical agents seeping into cellars, killing men, women and children where they were taking refuge.
I'm sure nobody watching would dispute that what those scenes that we saw in Duma were appalling. But that what they would also probably say is, why should we be sort of shutting our eyes and holding our noses when we see Assad committing other kinds of terrible atrocities against his own people?
Well, we're neither shutting our eyes nor holding our noses. We are seeking to hold Assad to account at the UN Security Council and in other international forums, despite the fact that he has been protected, in particular by Russia, but also by other friends like Iran, sadly, at the moment. But the key point here is that chemical weapons, like biological weapons, like nuclear weapons, are subject to very strict international prohibitions. The OPCW, the international body that looks at these things, has 4 times now reported that the regime in Syria is responsible for the use of chemical weapons against their own citizens. And on each occasion, when we've tried to hold Assad to account at the United Nations, Russia has vetoed our attempts to do that successfully. So we felt on this occasion the only way in which we and allied countries could actually degrade that chemical weapons capability, stop these ghastly attacks happening again and deter others from using chemical weapons, was the sort of very targeted military intervention that we've undertaken.
When do you think you'll know for certain whether it's worked?
Well, that's something that our military experts will be looking at on a daily basis.
Very good to see you, Mr. Lidington, and see you again soon, I hope. Welcome back to Peston on Sunday. I'm joined by Emily Thornberry, the Shadow Foreign Secretary. But first, Allegra.
Well, Robert, this week, no less a figure than the UN Secretary-General suggested that the Cold War is back. Here is his tweet. Everything's done on Twitter. The Cold War is back with a vengeance, but with a difference. So we thought we would take the opportunity to look at how the two sides would square up. And to be honest, I can't quite believe we're doing this in 2018, but we're doing it nonetheless. Right, defence spending, the US, a massive whopping $550 billion versus, it's tiny down here because we've done it to scale, $70 billion for Russia. Then to take one example of that, aircraft carriers, 20 for the US, just 1 for Russia. There's lots of other numbers we could mention, but we've just gone for these ones. Now, this is why experts think that Russia resorts to disruptive cyber warfare, because it cannot rely on conventional war power, except this last one, which terrifies all of us, nuclear warheads. The best guesstimates nudge them ahead. They have 7,300 versus just under 7,000 for America. Which is why, over here on the front of the Sunday Times, another tactic is being suggested. The Sunday Times have this story, that the Russians are going to resort to something called compromat, which you better get used to as a concept, a Cold War-era concept of using compromising material to undermine your enemies. This story here suggesting Theresa May's been told that members of the cabinet and Britain's elite are now vulnerable. Robert.
Gosh, so there's a thought. Emily, we'll talk about Russia in a minute or two, but look, a very straightforward question. Was the Prime Minister right to join France and America in bombing Syria?
No, I think that it was the wrong thing to do. I think that at times of war, we have to be very careful about what we do, and we should always act. I think we should always act multilaterally. I mean, in the end, you know...
Well, it was multilateral. We were with 2 of our closest allies.
Yeah, I'm talking about properly multilaterally. What we were trying to do was... The world had agreed that chemical weapons were beyond the pale. That was a world agreement. And what we should do when people breach that agreement is that we should act as one community. We should act as one world. And what we needed to do is to work through the United Nations and to work carefully on irrefutable evidence. Now,
but can I just ask you, do you have any doubt in your own mind that that appalling chemical weapons attack in Douma was caused by anybody else other than Assad?
Can I put it this way? Whatever my own personal feelings, Matt has said the day before, we have no evidence, we only have social media. We have to make sure that we get the whole world to work together. We cannot allow the Russians to undermine the action that we want to take by saying that there isn't clear evidence.
President Macron said...
Let me finish this. And because it's really important, this. The OPCW was about to go in and was about to establish that chemical weapons had been used. We did not have that sort of irrefutable evidence at that point, the sort of evidence that you need before taking action multilaterally. And that is what we should do. And when I was out in the States and I was talking to senators and congressmen, they agreed that the great concern was that if we acted too early, and why were we acting so quickly? Because Donald Trump put out a tweet saying that he wanted to act within 48 hours.
Emily, look, but I've got to pick you up. The OPCW's mandate at the moment would not allow the OPCW to ascribe responsibility for the attack. They are over there to verify that chemical weapons were used, but they're not allowed to say we think Assad or somebody else is to blame. And we know that Russia will veto any attempt to ascribe blame. So what you're saying is there is no possibility of a military attack.
So let me answer that. So what we have to do is we have to do it in stages. So on Monday, when I was at the Security Council, what we could have done was that we could have agreed a UN Security Council mandate to send in the OPCW, to give them safe passage, to get in and first baseline produce irrefutable evidence that chemical weapons had been used, number one. And then we need to move on and we need to be able to start looking at who is to blame. But we need to take it in stages and we need to bank what we can. And we haven't done that. And why haven't we done it? Because Donald Trump has been tweeting that he wants to do something within 48 hours. Now,
so I have to pick you up. Sorry, I understand the arguments and they're very important. They're very important. But we've got limited time and I do just have to ask a very precise question, which is, if you'd gone through all of those stages and Russia still vetoed a UN Security Council resolution authorising a strike, would you, in those circumstances, have been prepared to go ahead with military action?
OK, so you've asked a precise question. Give me time to give you a precise answer. You have to do it in two stages. You begin by proving that chemical weapons have been used.
Yep.
You then come to an agreement multilaterally as to what organisation. There's one called the GIM, which has had problems and has been seen to be, you know, controversial and so on, but they needed to have a clear idea of who was going to go in what circumstances, in order to be able to attribute blame. If blame is then attributed, then the world takes action, and if the Russians then veto, then that puts us in a completely different situation.
But
what has happened instead is that they have driven a coach and horses through that, which would have been a careful path, and that is the way that you act multilaterally in order to enforce multilateral agreements. In the end, what they're doing is they're saying there's been a breach of international law, and yet they rush to judgment, they rush to action, and they do it by ignoring the United Nations, by not... You need to be in the room. You need to listen to the dynamics of the Security Council. If the whole world was saying there is clear evidence, Russia, that who it is that is responsible, then the pressure is completely different. But instead, we have given them a way of copping out.
But all that may well be true.
Well, it's quite a lot.
No, but I still need to know, and I think everybody watching will need to know, is having gone through that process, would you be prepared to use the concept in international law that if a humanitarian crisis looms, you would be prepared to bomb?
Well, first of all, there's a major argument about whether humanitarian intervention exists as a legal concept.
Which is why I'm asking you.
So, you know, and it is argued that there are some lawyers in the Foreign Office who believe in it, but they don't have a lot of allies across the world. So what we do need to do is we need to make sure that we get as big a coalition of countries across the world as possible, and then move from that. And we need to work together. We need to work together. It cannot be Donald Trump and a couple of allies deciding unilaterally that they will decide on this when we haven't even had the OPCW having time to make a decision. We have been here before. We have been here before when we have not had clear evidence about weapons of mass destruction. We do not need to go down that path again.
But unfortunately, what people will pick up from what you're saying is you are not prepared to say that there are circumstances in which you would take military action if Russia persisted with the veto.
No. No, what people will hear is they will hear that it was wrong for Theresa May to go in so quickly with just because Donald Trump had put out a late-night tweet, and that is not the... Listen, we are in a very dangerous place now, where the international world order is breaking down.
Can I ask why you're not answering my question? Why are you not answering my question?
Well, I am answering your question. You're just not listening to what I'm saying.
You are avoiding the point which most people want to know is, would a Labour government in any circumstances, in the presence of a Russian veto, would a Labour government bomb?
Well, for example, we went in Kosovo when the Russians vetoed, but the rest of the
world agreed.
And I approved of that. And I approved of that. And that was because it was the will of the world with Russia vetoing that something should be done. That's a much stronger place to be in than our current position. Why are we doing this at the moment when the international order is breaking down in the way in which it is? It is our job as a member of the Security Council to take that really seriously. The world order and taking due process is not something that we should just ignore.
And can I just very finally, we haven't got a lot of time, will you press for a retrospective vote or some kind of vote in the coming days that would, in a sense, bind the Prime Minister's hand so that she would, in future, have to come back and get MPs' approval?
It's our view that we should, and the Conservatives have in the past promised this, and yet they've gone back on that promise. We think that it should be in law that there should be a vote in Parliament before we take military action. Not urgent cases, not when we're under attack or, you know, if the Prime Minister has been kidnapped or anything like that. I mean, obviously that's a complete, obviously that's a completely different situation. But if they have time to announce it, if they have time to consider it and make a decision, frankly, circumstances like now, where they feel that they have to go now, before Congress sits, before Parliament sits, you know, that was part of the reason why they had to go so quickly, because they did not want to be accountable to the elected representatives of America and the elected representatives of the UK, and that's not right.
But just very simply, Prime Minister makes a statement tomorrow. Is that going to be enough, or will you press for a wider debate and a vote at the end of that?
I think that the Prime Minister making a statement and members of Parliament getting up and asking her questions is not proper accountability. So there are a number of mechanisms that we will be looking at, and we've yet to decide exactly which the most appropriate one is.
Emily Thornberry, good to see you again.
Nice to see you too.
So let's find out what Chuka and Nadine made of that. Chuka, the Shadow Foreign Secretary did not agree with you that it was right to bomb.
Well, I think, first of all, a few thoughts. I think we've got to stop scribing Iraq and the lack of weapons of mass destruction onto every subsequent conflict. This is a different situation. Western powers are seeking regime change in that case. This is a very different situation. Secondly, there is evidence, it may not be irrefutable, I'd suggest there is strong evidence that chemical weapons were used in this case. We know the OPCW has said that Assad has used chemical weapons before, so we have that. And the last thing I would say, of course you want to build the broadest coalition, international coalition possible, but it is unrealistic to expect to have unanimity in the international community to act. And the problem the UN has at the moment is because of Russia and its inevitable exercise of a veto on the Security Council, the UN is rendered toothless. My biggest worry in that situation is that when you have a very clear signal that you have a despot like Assad using chemical weapons, that the international community decides it's not going to do anything. And I think that sends a terrible signal and actually can lead to more suffering and bloodshed. Often in these situations, it's not a question of whether there is going to be, destruction and, unfortunately, at times, death. The question is, how do you actually reduce the likelihood of that happening in the future? But look, nobody's got a monopoly of wisdom on these things. None of us know things for certain, and I don't pretend to.
Emily Thornberry made a compelling point, didn't she, that this was, to a large extent, about sucking up to Donald Trump, this bombing?
No, I don't think that's a point at all. And if it's sucking up to Donald Trump, Emily also made the point that there needs to be an international coalition. Well, we have that. We have Angela Merkel supporting the action, France, New Zealand, Australia. And as I said, Spain...
Actually, I'm not... Hang on a second. Actually, what we've got is a Downing Street report of conversations that she's had with a number of leaders.
You're doubting those?
No, I'm just saying very few leaders have actually stood up in public and said this was the right thing to do.
Well, because it's after the event, I would imagine. But, I don't think we should be, and I don't think Emily should be calling for the hands of any future Prime Minister to be tied on the basis of humanitarian action being taken.
But hang on a second, she also said that the prerogative power, she also said that even if there were this legislation enacted, the prerogative power in an emergency to take action would be retained.
Possibly, but I do not think...
You could at least have a debate. I mean, I think
at the very... we are going to have a debate.
Yes, but before the event, you could at the very least have had a debate before the jets were sent in. We have, I mean, recall, Nadine is right, is not always straightforward. Not everybody can actually attend Parliament when you have a recall call, but we had multiple recalls, actually, I seem to remember, in the 2010 to 2015 Parliament on all kinds of issues, like, for example, the 2011 riots. So... I mean, certainly on that, Emily is absolutely right. There should have been consultation of Parliament on that.
Now, look, I'm now joined by Caroline Lucas, the co-leader of the Green Party. Caroline, you're against the bombing, or you think that what Theresa May did was wrong, but you presumably think that Assad's gassing of small children and civilians was equally appalling. How do we prevent it?
Well, it was absolutely appalling. Of course it was. But I think what we need to do is, instead of thinking about just how we lurch from one crisis to another, and certainly the chemical attack was absolutely obscene, what I think we need to be doing is investing far more resources in waging peace rather than waging war, and it's an awful lot more difficult. And by that I mean...
But it looks as though this strike hasn't killed any innocent people, has degraded, to use that awful phrase there, chemical weapons capacity. So surely that's a good thing.
We don't know how much it's degraded their capacity. There's lots of evidence to suggest, or at least there are people suggesting that already some of the chemical weapons were moved to other sites to avoid the airstrikes. But the bigger point I wanted to make was this, that we lurch from one crisis to another. We don't invest in long-term peace building. And by that I mean, for example, right now we're talking about chemical weapons. God forbid, in 5 or 10 years' time, we might be talking about nuclear weapons. Right now, there is a process going on at the UN with 122 other countries to introduce a weapons ban treaty. The UK couldn't even be bothered to turn up. So it seems to me that instead of being kind of pushed into a knee-jerk reaction to doing something that we don't know is a success. It's still far too early to say what kind of response we're going to have. Instead of doing that, we should be using the time to reform the UN, to be properly investing in those peace-building initiatives, so that when a crisis comes like this, we're not only saying the only possible response to this is to bomb what is already a tinderbox. Just one spark could set off a real conflagration. So it seems to me that we are looking at this the wrong way around.
I mean, obviously, one of the greatest threats to our security is the widening gulf with Russia. Was the Prime Minister right to expel those Russian spies?
Yes, I think she was right. I think all of the evidence did point to Russian involvement in that. But I think as well, we should be looking at sanctions.
So how do we establish a sensible dialogue with Russia?
I think it has to be a two-track approach, doesn't it? There has to be a carrot and the stick. And I think when it comes to the sticks, we need to be a lot more serious when it comes to sanctions on Russia, even if that means hurting the EU and even ourselves come to that when we put those sanctions on. We've seen the US sanctions now finally beginning to have an impact. They put those sanctions on oligarchs, and just last Monday, we've seen a real collapse in the stock exchange in Russia. We've seen the ruble fall to a 3-year low. So sanctions can work when we're serious about them. My fear about this airstrike is that, in a sense, it was there to send a message. Well, sending messages by airstrikes is a very risky thing to do, particularly when you've got at least 3 nuclear-armed countries involved in that conflict.
Now, we're going to get a statement in the Commons about the Syria bombings by the Prime Minister tomorrow. Is that sufficient parliamentary involvement?
I think it's outrageous that essentially Theresa May chose the timing for the bombing simply to avoid a debate in Parliament. I think that's what she was doing. I think she knows that her strategy, so-called, doesn't...
So are you going to push for a debate?
Absolutely, they're going to push for a debate and a vote. There is no strategy behind this bombing. Even if you thought airstrikes were the right strategy, there is no sense of what does success look like, what happens when, if Syria uses chemical weapons again, do we just keep escalating and escalating? Where's the end game? Where's the exit strategy? None of that has been debated, and Parliament is the place where that should happen.